with Chapter 7, we begin our study of macroeconomics. Okay, so if you recall at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that economics is kind of divided up into two halves. Microeconomics, where the focus is on companies and individuals and firms and so forth, and macroeconomics, where we take a step back and we look at the economy as a whole. Okay. And so that's what we're kind of starting here in Chapter 7, where we're taking a look at the economy as a whole. Okay, so Chapter 7. Now, if we want to take a look at the economy as a whole and kind of understand it from a top-level view, first thing we have to do is try to measure economic activity. Okay, and so that's what GDP is. Okay, GDP is just a measurement of economic production, of economic activity, of all the things bought and sold. Okay. Now it's not perfect, and at the end of this chapter, we'll spend some time going through those problems and errors and reasons why GDP is not perfect, but it does a decent job in terms of measuring economic activity. Okay. So that's what we need to do here in the beginning. Okay, is basically talk about what we mean when we measure economic activity. Okay, so that's what we'll do in this video. In the videos that follow, we'll go through some of those things that can complicate measuring economic activity, right? So the next videos we'll talk about how we actually calculate GDP. After that, we'll deal with how inflation affects our ability to measure and compare GDP over time and prices and so forth. And then we'll get to, at the end, some of the downsides, some of the errors and problems with GDP. GDP is not perfect. It's a little over 100 years old, and we're still trying to do a better job in measuring economic activity. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to do here in Chapter 7 as we begin our study of macroeconomics. All right, so let's first talk about GDP. So GDP stands for gross domestic product. Okay. So the definition is that it is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. Okay. All right. Simple enough. Okay. But let's focus on a couple of these key words, and that's what I've got down here. So let's talk about the first one. Okay. So notice here in the beginning of the definition, I say it's the total market value. So what do we mean by this? Well, if we're going to measure these goods and services that are produced and then sold in a country, we have to figure out how we value them, right? So what value should be placed on them? Well, as we've talked about before, as we've talked about prices, what are prices? Prices are the value that society places on goods, right? So if society values something very highly, that usually pushes the price up, right? And so the market price is basically the social value, right? It's the value that all of us in the economy place on these different goods, on water, on ice, on diamonds, on timber, on juice, loofahs, Twinkies, everything, right? So the best way to kind of add up these values is just basically add up the price, right? So that's what we mean by market value. This just means the price of the good. Price of the good. Okay. All right. So gross domestic product is the total market value, that is the price, the value that society places on it, of all final goods and services. Okay, so the second word here, final. Okay, what we mean by this is when it is sold to the consumer. Okay, so we'll talk on the next slide about intermediate goods, but there's a risk when we're adding everything up of counting things twice. Okay. And so to kind of make sure we don't do that, we only calculate things in GDP when they're finally sold to the consumer, right? And the next slide we'll talk about intermediate goods. What we mean is that, right, suppose I'm the company Smuckers and I'm going to make strawberry jam. I need to buy strawberries, right? Well, in that sense, strawberries are a good I'm using to produce something else, right? But if I go to the store and buy strawberries in the store, that's a final product, right? So we only consider something a final product when it's sold to the consumer, not when businesses get the product to make something else, okay? So we only count it when it's sold to the consumer, right? So that's what we mean by final, when it's sold to the consumer, right? And then the third key word here is within a country, all right? So GDP is the total market value, that is the price, we're adding all those things up, of all those goods and services when they're finally sold to the consumer, okay? Produced within a country during a specific period. So within a country means within a country. That is, we don't care about the nationality of the company, right? So nationality of company doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Right? So when Toyota manufactures cars here in the United States, right, they have a big auto manufacturing plant here in the US. Toyota's a Japanese company, but because it is produced here in the United States, we count it in US GDP. Same thing goes for German cars, BMWs, Porsches. When they're manufactured here in the United States, it counts in US GDP. As the production takes place here in the US, even if the company is an international or foreign company, right, it counts in US GDP, okay? So that's what we're keeping track of here. We're totaling up all those, the market value, that is the price of all those goods when it's sold to consumers in a country during a particular period. Usually it's a year or a quarter, and I'll get to that in a second, okay? All right, so that's what GDP is. All right, so previous slide, I talked about final goods and services. That is when they're sold to the consumer, okay? So we don't count intermediate goods in the calculation of GDP because we do not want to double count goods in GDP. Okay, that's the primary reason. So, what is an intermediate good? Okay, well, as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, these are the goods that businesses buy. These are the resources that businesses buy when they're making something else. So again, the example I used was Smucker's, right? So Smucker's, when they go to make strawberry jam, they need to get strawberries, right? So those strawberries are then smashed and sugar and other stuff's added to it to make strawberry jam, right? So when Smucker's buys those strawberries, if we counted that in GDP, and then Smucker's takes the strawberries and converts them into jam and then sells it, and then we count that in GDP, we've then counted those strawberries twice, right? We counted it when Smucker's bought the strawberries, and then we count those strawberries again when they sell the jam, right? So that's an example of double counting, right? We only want to include those strawberries in GDP once, right? Because that's accurate, that makes sense. If you're counting things twice, that's fraud, that's incorrect, that's error, right? So we don't include intermediate goods, we only count it when it's sold to the consumer, okay? And that's our way of just making sure that we're calculating GDP correctly, okay? Okay. So, all right, GDP does not include intermediate goods, only final goods and services when they're sold to the consumer, okay? All right. In addition, okay, we only basically include kind of new production in GDP, okay? So only transactions involving, and I should put in here, new production, count, okay? So things that do not count, right? All those nice used items that we pick up off of Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever website you prefer, or garage sales, used items do not count in GDP. GDP is only keeping track of new production, okay? So used items not counted in GDP, right? keep in mind, those items, when they were new and purchased, were counted in GDP way back when. But when they're resold as used, not counted in GDP because it's not new production. Okay. Okay. In addition, we do not count the sale of stocks and bonds. The sale of stocks and bonds is not new production, right? A stock is a piece of paper that says you have ownership in a company, right? So if I sell that stock to somebody else, I'm just transferring ownership of a company, right? Nothing's being produced, okay? Same thing with a bond. A bond is a piece of paper that says a company owes me money or a government owes me money in the case of a government bond, right? And if I sell that bond, I'm not producing anything, right? I'm just transferring basically ownership of that loan, that bond, to somebody else, okay? So the sale of stocks and bonds are not counted in GDP, okay? However, what is counted are the financial services provided by, say, stockbrokers or traders or something like that when they're executing the trade. So what is counted are the services of financial professionals. Financial, there we go. Financial professionals, there we go. Okay, what I mean by this is, suppose I call up my financial company where I have my retirement assets, investment funds there with them, right? And I say, okay, tell you what, I want you to sell Microsoft stock and buy Caterpillar stock, right? And that person says, okay, sure, Dr. Connors, I can do this for you, right? A lot of times when I execute those trades, right, and my broker or whoever does it, they charge a commission, right? This is a fee for processing these buying and selling of stocks, right? And so that fee would count in GDP, right? This is someone who's providing a service for me. This is a new service provided, so that would be counted in GDP. So what is counted are the services of financial professionals, okay? The value of the stocks and bonds themselves, right? Suppose I sell $10,000 of Microsoft stock. That $10,000 of stock is not counted in GDP. Only the services provided by the broker is counted in GDP, okay? All right, the last piece here, that's again another example of things not counted in GDP are income transfers, right? So Social Security, C-U-R-I-T-Y, Social Security and welfare, right? These are just transfers of money, through the government from one set of taxpayers to a different set, right? Social Security is a transfer of money from working people to retired people. Welfare is a transfer of money from taxpayers to basically poor people who are on welfare, right? There's no new production taking place here, so therefore we're not going to count it, right? So income transfers are not counted in GDP. Now, once those people get the money, right? So if retired people get their Social Security and they go and buy things, the things they buy, that's counted in GDP, right? Because they're buying something that was produced, right? But the money that's transferred to them is not counted in GDP, okay? Okay, so I mentioned before that, again, we basically consider production in a country, okay? And again, this goes back a ways, right? It used to be we didn't have GDP. We actually had GNP, or Gross National Product, okay? And basically we kept track of all the goods and services produced by Americans, right? Or by Japanese or by Canadians, right? That's how they kept track of a country's production. But what happened in the 1980s and 90s is we basically entered a globalized world, right? Everything became interconnected, and so it didn't make sense to keep track of it based on nationality anymore, right? And so that's why we throw nationality out the window and we just keep track of what's produced in a particular country. Okay. So in these examples here, right, a BMW produced in Tennessee, right? So yes, this counts in US GDP. This counts in US GDP. Okay. Even though BMW is a German automobile company, because the manufacturing plant is here in the United States, these cars are produced and sold here in the United States, that would count in US GDP. All right, a Ford produced in Mexico, right? Well, Ford is a US company, right? But if this Ford is produced in Mexico and then sold in Mexico, no, that's going to count in Mexican GDP. No, counts in Mexico's GDP. Okay, all right, so far so good. What about, again, we talked about globalization and this interconnected world, these interconnected supply chains we have today. What about U.S. goods or parts that are produced here, then shipped overseas to, say, China, right? Suppose different parts of an iPhone made here, sent over to China. They're assembled at a Foxconn plant in Guangzhou, right? And then that iPhone is then put on a boat and shipped back over to the U.S. How do we disentangle all those things, right? Well, what we do is anything that's produced here in the United States and shipped abroad, that's what we call an export. Right? So these are the things that are produced here and shipped abroad. Okay, so we add those. Okay, we count those in. Okay, when that good comes back in, we subtract the imports. These are the goods that are produced elsewhere and imported. Okay. And in the next video, we'll actually go through and kind of do these calculations, exports, imports, etc. Okay. Okay, but that's just kind of a top-level idea of how we keep track of goods, where they're produced, where it counts in GDP in our kind of globalized world. Okay, so the last piece here for this video is just to mention, look, when we calculate GDP, we usually do it for a year or for a quarter, okay? And I gotta take monthly off this slide. Generally, when we're doing this, because it is, extensive when we're calculating, adding up all these figures, we generally do it quarterly or yearly, okay? If you go to the website of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, just go to www.bea.gov. It's exciting. And then go to their interactive data and go find GDP. You'll basically see they have it listed there quarterly, that is every 3 months, or for the year, okay? And so usually that's the time period where we're adding all this up, right? So for GDP in, say, 2020, right, that's all the production that happened in the year 2020. For the year 2021, that's all the production that happened in 2021, etc. For 2022, same thing. Everything that happened in the year 2022, okay? And so that's how we add it up, right? We added up final market value, which is the price, again, when it's sold to the consumer in a country, that means we don't really care about the nationality, and we usually calculate this every year or quarterly, okay?